Welcome to Climate News Weekly. I'm here with my co-hosts Julio Friedmann and Darren Howe. Good to see you guys.
Pleasure as always.
Good to be back.
All right, Julio, do you want to kick us off this week?
Yes, there was an interesting story that was reported in the Wall Street Journal about a new study in which AI looked at all the climate policy for the past 20 years or so. And what's interesting is there's actually enough climate policies to train an AI model, 1,500 policies, and tried to understand the effect those policies actually had on emissions reduction. It's important for the audience to know that the study scope ended in 2022, so the IRA was not in that. The bipartisan infrastructure law was not in that. But it was a look back at saying what worked. And the headline is that out of the 1,500 policies, 63 made a difference.
Can you say anything about the methodology? How was it possible to really discern signal from noise in that assessment?
The part what they did is they looked for places where there was profound and substantive emissions reduction. Often they would see a point in time that led to a dramatic decrease, and that's all charted out for many different countries. I think there were 15 different countries they assessed in total, including South Africa and Denmark and China. Like, they looked at lots of different countries. And then they looked at the policies. Where was there a point in time where a policy was introduced and then within a window you saw that change in emissions? And the authors were clear to say, like, there's only so much of this we can interpret. They also looked at the fact that sometimes policies individually did not have much impact, but as a group they did.
Mm-hmm.
An example of that was labeling. Labeling on its own, no impact at all. But as one of other policy measures, perhaps it did. Same thing with fossil fuel subsidies. Individually, fossil fuel subsidy reform, no difference, did not affect emissions at all. But in collective action with other policies had a substantial impact.
I thought it's interesting here, just, in the article, it says that these studies collectively successfully reduced as much as 1.8 billion metric tons of carbon.
Right.
Like, that they're attributing to these policies, which is, when we think about the relative impact of technologies versus policy, this is notable.
But there were two big categories where policies really had impact. One of them was basically mandates and regulations.
Right.
So energy efficiency standards, big one. Building codes, big ones. CAFE standards, big ones. Emissions cap, big ones. Like, those ones had real impact. The other was subsidies and things like the wind production tax credit, feed-in tariffs in Europe. Those also had an impact.
Yeah.
And interestingly, this study looked across many different sectors, many different potential pathways. It looks and smells to me like it's divined what actually makes a difference, which is good, because now we know what to do and how to do it.
And on a related story in Bloomberg is the launch of a new methane eye in the sky from nonprofit CarbonMapper that SpaceX is scheduled to launch. Actually was scheduled, I believe it has now launched.
It has now launched.
The Tanager 1 satellite. And this promises to be provide the support for these sorts of policies, in that it promises accountability to emissions reduction goals that emitters are setting. So what's fascinating here to me, it's sort of unbelievable. This satellite, and I'm quoting from the article in Bloomberg, no bigger than a mini fridge, will be able to attribute emissions within 50 meters of the source. That is amazing.
It is high precision and high accuracy, yes.
Methane and carbon dioxide from individual facilities.
Right.
Objective measurement from the sky. We will know. It will be very clear. There will be clear maps that show where all this is coming from.
But and it doesn't necessarily measure flux, which is tricky because you need the time signals for flux. But it does show where, at a point in time, where there's a big emission. And for carbon dioxide, that's less important. It'll ultimately help. For methane, it's hugely important. One of the challenges with monitoring methane is that there are these super emitters that are episodic. They don't emit constantly. They don't emit consistency, but then suddenly they will belch a whole bunch of methane. And so having this constant, regular ability to detect at that level of precision and fidelity is a game changer. And it will enable regulators to be more proactive, possibly in a friendly way, saying, hey, you have this facility where, like, you may not know this is happening, but it's emitting a ton of methane. Why don't you fix it? But it will also put some teeth behind things like the methane rule and things other policies like it, which will say if you are caught emitting, then you're on the hook to fix it, or you have to be fined, or some other sort of issue. It has been for many years true. The oil and gas industry knew this was coming. This was inevitable, and they have said for years there's no place to hide. That day, though, is today. There is now no longer a place to hide. All emitters will be seen in any country, in any industry, and that'll help us reduce methane emissions for real.
Yeah, it's also interesting to think about what it might do to, there have been debates about, look, we're going to need fossil fuels, to run our economy for some time, and so where should we be producing these things, and where should we not be producing these things? And I wonder to what degree this kind of mapping will influence that debate, that discussion. Like if you see, for example, that facilities in the U.S. are much cleaner than facilities in other countries, what does that do to that conversation?
Well, not only that, but even within the United States, if the Marcellus domain is much cleaner than the Permian Basin, what does that mean? But the last point that I'll make here, though, is it certainly looks like we'll be using natural gas for a long time.
Mm.
We might not be using coal for a long time. It looks like we're starting to decline on oil, but we're going to be using natural gas for a long time. If that's true, it better be a lot cleaner than today. And the
Right.
upstream methane emissions are the thing that a lot of people worry about. This satellite will really give regulators, environmental groups, governments the tools that they need to reduce those upstream emissions profoundly.
Yeah. And for those listening, you might be thinking, "Oh, didn't we hear this already?" Well, you heard something similar. So EDF earlier this year launched their own methane satellite, another nonprofit doing something similar. And I think it's interesting to think about this trend now that these technologies are cheap enough. You have nonprofits that are doing the development. We're not talking about billions and billions of dollars of, through national labs or, large private companies. These are nonprofits that are developing these satellites, then paying SpaceX to launch them into orbit and provide these streams of data. And this is just the very first step in CarbonMapper, the CarbonMapper Coalition's plan to be able to observe 90% of all major sources of emissions globally. So this is very cool, and it'll be very interesting to see how this develops over time.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I love that NGOs have space programs.
Yeah, that's amazing. Darren, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. Well, this is a little bit of a change, but speaking of other energy substances, wanted to talk a bit about hydrogen. Over the past few weeks, we've seen quite a few articles come out, including some from CTVC and Sightline, as well as Bloomberg, talking about the realities of hydrogen projects being developed, or rather not. So essentially, over the past few years, we've had yet another hydrogen boom cycle. The IRA came out with a very generous, up to, I think, $3 per kilogram tax credit, which incentivized a lot of people to pivot and go focus on the production of clean hydrogen. That being said, what we're seeing now is a lot of realities in project development. We're seeing a lot of projects being called off, being stopped, being, the plug is pulled. And the reason that is happening is, well, there's not one single reason. It's always very complex. Two of the interesting things I noticed were, one, the fact that building these plants became much more expensive as interest rates came up, as grid infrastructure became much harder to come by, etc. So the cost side of building this infrastructure ballooned past what people expected. But number two, which I think is even more important, is the fact that offtake agreements have been pretty lousy, for lack of a better word. Anyone in the project finance space will know, or the project development space will know, but you do not go and loan money to a project unless you know who is paying for it and having a very clear return. I think the question to ask is, why is this happening? And Julio, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. So on the one hand, the biggest buyers of offtake agreements for hydrogen have been kind of new industries that traditionally haven't used hydrogen, airlines, for example. I think there might be a few others, because they're able to think of, okay, well, we don't have an existing infrastructure here. Let's figure out how we do it from a blank slate. On the other hand, industries like ammonia, which are a major consumer of hydrogen, they may struggle to just say, oh, let's just source clean hydrogen, because the way they source hydrogen today is very tightly linked with fossil fuel infrastructure. Typically, they actually will make a deal with oil and gas companies, situate their plants at the same site as a refinery, so that when they do steam methane reformation at that refinery, they just take that hydrogen that comes out and produce ammonia. I'm not saying all of them work that way, but that seems to be an illustration of why it's not easy to just say, okay, let's not use dirty hydrogen. Let's use green hydrogen now.
When you talk to the fertilizer companies or the refiners or people making sustainable fuels of various kinds, they are actually very simple. And this is the hard part of getting hydrogen up and running. Their position is, hey, I'd love to buy green hydrogen. Is it at price parity? The answer is no. It costs 4 times to 10 times more. They're like, I'm not going to pay that. Our customers aren't going to pay that. Let us know when you're cheap enough. Even with the incentive stack, it's not cheap enough. Second thing, they say, can you deliver it at a time? Will it be up by 2027? Because I have to have hydrogen in 2027. If I'm going to sever my contract and buy green hydrogen, you guys better deliver. And the provider's like, well, that's not entirely in my control. I need green electricity. I need the permit and the stuff. Well, call us back when you're tall enough to go on this ride. And then the third one is, can you guarantee the volumes? Price, time, volume. If you don't have that, you don't have an offtake. And green hydrogen builders are suddenly going, oh, I can't compete on price, I can't guarantee volume, and I can't guarantee delivery time. So what we've discovered at the heart of all this is that supply is not sufficient. You can't just make clean supply and expect that that will just go into the market. You actually need to have policy pull for the buyers as well. You need to manage that demand risk so that the people who will take hydrogen can take it.
It seems also that it implies that you should really be very customer focused, right? Like if you're going to do this, your strategy has to be focused on like the nuanced needs and demands of a very specific type of customer, where, Julio, maybe there are ways to mitigate some of the factors you mentioned.
Right. So, for example, we've seen some green hydrogen projects go forward for a fertilizer company, Yara, in Norway. Yara has policy metrics they need to hit in Norway. That's what's driving them. They have customers who want to buy their fertilizer in Europe who have policy metrics requiring clean. Like there needs to be a demand pull as well as supply push. The thing that people miss in the hydrogen discussion is hydrogen is not like crude oil. You don't just put it on tankers and send it around the world. It's a refined product. And so as a buyer, you have to have the finished product in volume and price. And these are globally traded commodities. They've got to be globally competitive.
But let me talk about Voltera's debt financing news, because we were just talking about offtake agreements for hydrogen. This is a really interesting case where the offtake agreements are starting to work in the EV charging space. So the news is that over the last week, Voltera announced that it secured a $100 million debt facility to support the build out of its fleet EV charging infrastructure. And what's important about that and why they were able to get that debt facility is because they're backstopped by customer offtake agreements to use their infrastructure. Whenever you're developing infrastructure, this is not going to be news to any of the project finance folks out there, but whenever you develop infrastructure, you typically have several tiers of capital. The most expensive but most flexible tier of capital would be equity, right? So your VC or your private equity capital, they expect a high rate of return and they expect a lot of growth. So typically when you're building projects like this, it's not a good idea to use equity because it's expensive. You'd rather use much lower cost of capital. So this is a little bit simplistic, but another form of capital would be project finance capital. So these are people who are expecting, let's say, somewhere between 15 to 20% returns. In order to accept that lower rate of return, they expect a lower risk for your project. Historically, EV charging companies have been financed with equity and also with project capital. But the third tier, and what would be most important for folks to unlock, would be debt capital. So for debt, you're basically saying, hey, I just expect, it's kind of like a bank. I expect an 8% return on my capital. It's very cheap. So if you can lever up on that debt and then return better returns, then you juice your IRR, you juice your return on investment. The issue is that a lot of banks have been unwilling to take the risk of providing debt capital to EV charging providers because utilization has been a massive question mark for them. It still is for public charging infrastructure. If someone opens a charging station, a block down from yours, who knows what that does to your utilization? It's very difficult for banks to backstop that. However, what these fleet EV charging providers are doing is securing these long-term agreements. Typically, there will be some sort of minimum offtake guarantee. I'm not sure how this one is structured, but that provides a floor for what the banks are willing to underwrite. And it basically converts the risk from utilization of the charger to creditworthiness of the offtake customer. And if you're dealing with fleets, especially some of the really large ones out there that move most of our goods around the country, that risk is probably a little bit more acceptable for banks to take. So this is actually really good news for the industry, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens moving forward.
Yeah. So I want to turn to another article today, and this is a different topic, but writing the rules around net zero. This is an article that appeared in the FT, and it talks about how the tech companies are kind of working behind the scenes to set the rules for what it means to be net zero. And so this at issue here principally is how you count the power, the electricity that your company uses. So this is scope 2 emissions associated with that net zero target, and to some degree scope 3 emissions as well. So by some metrics, if you don't count the provenance of the power that you're using, you can look very green, have a very low carbon footprint. Then if you do count that, of course, especially if you're a tech company and you need to power lots of data centers, you have a much, and you're not on a very clean grid, you obviously have a much higher carbon footprint. And so these rules are going to matter a lot. The FT does a really nice job of kind of presenting, with and without pictures for Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, Meta, and Apple, and what these rules will actually mean to them.
So at the heart of this question in today's accounting scheme is RECs. RECs are renewable energy certificates or renewable electricity certificates, which allow you to separate the physical attribute of electricity generation, specifically clean and renewable electricity generation, from the place it's delivered, right? And that has been a mechanism we've used for a long time to get more renewable projects built. Like New Jersey has a RECs program in which people can build solar in New Jersey to displace fossil on the grid and get credit for it somewhere else. It's symptomatic of the fact that we don't have the infrastructure we need. It's symptomatic of the fact that we don't have the transmission grids. We don't have the physical generation assets. And so RECs are a way to sort of put that over.
Yeah, you make it one place, you claim the environmental benefit somewhere else, right?
Right. What we learned, as we could learn in other places, there's good RECs and bad RECs. Some RECs actually have a material impact on climate, some don't. And things like the 3 pillars ideas that Jesse Jenkins and others put forward for green hydrogen, what's being discussed in the IRS, are saying, no, you have to generate at time, you have to generate geographically locally. There are rules about what actually is materially important for this. And as we've discovered, we can't do that either. That's also hard. So tech companies are in this position where the way the rules are written are terrible for us, so we're just going to fail. We would rather think about what is it we're all trying to do and get credit for it. I got to say that what they're proposing is not necessarily great. It doesn't necessarily look, but it's premised on the fact that the accounting rules we put together are bad, and the solutions we would like to use, we can't use now. I think it's helpful to have a broader conversation. How should we actually think about reimagining the accounting rules broadly? And instead of just using them as a way to hit people over the head and say, boo, you're a bad person, what is it we're actually trying to solve for, and how do we build accounting rules that way? Right now, I don't think the ones that are being proposed do that, and I don't think the ones we have today do that. So we will have this conversation in a future episode.
Okay. The last thing I would point everyone to would be an article this week in the New York Times that illustrates tipping points. These are sort of points of no return in the Earth climate system response to climate change, and points out the effects on coral coral bleaching, ice sheet melting, ocean currents, and permafrost melting, and these other sort of points of no return. That is, once they start to happen, it is extremely hard or probably impossible for them to come back, and sort of points out where we are. The article does a great job of looking at that. And that came out on August 11th, a few days ago. Highly recommend looking at that piece. Anything else that we'd like to add today as we wrap up?
The thing I'll say about that study is the climate scientists, in part led by people like Johan Rockström in Potsdam, have done a good job of identifying 16 big tipping points in the climate system. And it looks like we're pretty close to 6 of them.
Yeah.
That's alarming and gives us more reason to get up every morning and do what we can on climate and energy transition.
Indeed. So on that note, I want to thank you guys for being here today, Darren and Julio, and we'll see you next time.